The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as delegates from across the galaxy settled into their seats. Representatives from the mighty Krex Empire, with their 4 arms and chitinous exoskeletons, dominated the front rows, while the ethereal Vorthak floated in their specialized atmospheric chambers along the walls. The crystalline Zephyrians chimed softly to each other, their translucent bodies refracting the lecture hall's bioluminescent lighting into prismatic displays. Professor Gorlith, a distinguished member of the Hegemony Council's Xenobiology Department, activated the massive holographic display. His tentacled form rippled with satisfaction as he surveyed the packed auditorium. 300 of the galaxy's finest minds had gathered for this month's installment of the Academy's most popular lecture series. "Honored colleagues," Gorlith began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades studying the galaxy's lesser species, "today we examine perhaps the most puzzling case in our taxonomic records. The humans of Sol 3. A ripple of amused chittering echoed through the chamber. The humans had been the subject of considerable academic interest since their recent discovery, though more as a curiosity than a serious study. "Consider the facts," Gorlith continued, manipulating the holographic display to show a rotating image of a human figure. "No natural armor plating, no environmental adaptations, no specialized hunting appendages. Their muscle density ranks among the lowest we've recorded. Their sensory organs are laughably limited. They can perceive only a narrow band of electromagnetic radiation and possess no magnetic field sensitivity whatsoever." The Krex delegation clicked their mandibles in derision. Their own carapaces could withstand plasma fire, and their compound eyes could see across 17 different spectrums simultaneously. "Furthermore," Gorlith added with obvious relish, "they possess no psionic abilities, no hive mind coordination, and no symbiotic partnerships with other species. They are, by every measurable standard, the weakest sapient race we have encountered." The Vorthak's mental emanations carried waves of amused condescension. Their collective consciousness had evolved beyond individual thought millennia ago, allowing them to coordinate fleets of ships as easily as moving limbs. Yet somehow, Gorlith paused for dramatic effect, they have managed to develop rudimentary technology and establish a primitive civilization. It serves as a fascinating case study in how even the most disadvantaged species can achieve basic sapience through sheer persistence. The audience erupted in appreciative sounds, clicks, chimes, and telepathic bursts of approval. This was exactly the kind of intellectual superiority they had come to expect from these lectures. "Their military capabilities," Gorlith added with a dismissive wave of his tentacles, "are particularly underwhelming. No natural weapons, no coordinated battle forms, no psychic warfare capabilities. They rely entirely on crude mechanical devices and individual combat. Approach so primitive it barely qualifies as warfare by galactic standards." The Zephyrians' crystalline forms shimmered with what passed for laughter among their kind. In the back corner of the auditorium, a figure that had been quietly taking notes slowly raised her hand. The motion caught Professor Gorleth's attention, and he peered through the sea of alien forms to identify the source. "Ah," he said with barely concealed delight, "it appears we have a human among us today. Please, do enlighten us with your perspective on our analysis." The young woman stood, her simple academy uniform marking her as an exchange student. Every alien eye, sensor, and consciousness in the room focused on her with predatory interest. This was an unexpected treat, a chance to demonstrate their intellectual superiority directly to one of the subjects under discussion. "I was wondering," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics, "if you could elaborate on human military history. Specifically, I'm curious about your assessment of our tactical development and strategic thinking." Professor Gorlith's form practically vibrated with anticipation. This was perfect. A human walking directly into intellectual humiliation. The audience leaned forward, eager to witness the systematic dismantling of whatever primitive notions this creature might hold about her species' capabilities. "Certainly, Gorlith," replied his tone dripping with condescension, "though I must warn you, The comparison between human military doctrine and actual galactic warfare is rather stark. He gestured to his holographic display, preparing to pull up what he expected would be embarrassingly simple tactical formations and crude weapons specifications. Your species' approach to conflict resolution is painfully linear, lacking the multi-dimensional thinking required for true strategic warfare. You fight in straight lines, use kinetic projectiles, and rely on individual decision-making rather than coordinated battle consciousness. The alien audience was practically salivating at this point. Several Krex warriors flexed their battle claws, while the Vorthak's collective consciousness hummed with anticipation of the coming intellectual massacre. Your generals and tacticians operate with the kind of primitive thinking we abandoned when we developed proper military doctrine, Gorlith continued, warming to his subject. Single-point leadership, hierarchical command structures, reliance on mechanical rather than biological weapons. It's all rather quaint, really. The human student nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting. Could you show us some specific examples from our military database? I'd be curious to see how our primitive tactics look when analyzed by someone with your expertise. Gorlith's tentacles writhed with pleasure. Oh, absolutely. Let me just access your species' military records and we can examine some particularly amusing examples of human strategic thinking. He turned to his console, confident that within moments he would be displaying the crude battle plans and simplistic tactical formations that would prove his point beyond any doubt. The holographic display flickered as Gorlith initiated the data request. The familiar blue glow of an active connection appeared, followed by the standard galactic database interface. He input the search parameters with practiced efficiency. Species, human, category, military history, access level, academic research. The response was immediate and unexpected. Access denied. Classification level, Omega Black. Authorization required. Hegemony Council, Command. Gorlith stared at the display, his tentacles twitching with confusion. He tried again, thinking perhaps he had made an error in the search parameters. Same result. He modified his approach, requesting only basic tactical information, then historical conflicts, then simple organizational charts. Every query returned the same response. Access denied. A murmur rippled through the audience as they noticed the professor's obvious discomfort. The human student remained standing, her expression neutral but attentive. I'm afraid there seems to be a minor technical difficulty, Gorlith announced, his voice strained. The database appears to be experiencing some connectivity issues. He quickly opened a private channel to the Academy's central database administrator, a multi-brained Quellian with security clearance far above his own. Administrator Korath, he transmitted. I'm having difficulty accessing basic military records for the human species. Could you assist? The response came back immediately, heavy with an emotion Gorlith couldn't quite identify. Professor, those records are sealed by direct order of the Hegemony Council. I don't have the authority to override that classification. Sealed? Gorlith's confusion was evident even through the communication link. But they're just primitive military records. What possible reason? I cannot discuss the reasoning behind the classification, Korath interrupted. All I can tell you is that anything relating to human military capabilities requires Omega Black clearance. Only 12 individuals in the entire galaxy have that level of access. The connection closed, leaving Gorlith staring at his console in bewilderment. Omega Black classification was reserved for the most sensitive intelligence in the galaxy. Planet-killer weapons, reality-warping technology, the locations of ancient doomsday devices. Why would the simple military history of a primitive species warrant such security? He became aware that the auditorium had fallen silent. 300 of the galaxy's most intelligent beings were watching him struggle with a simple data request. The human student still stood patiently, her hands no longer raised, but her question hanging in the air like a challenge. Perhaps, she said quietly, you could ask someone with the proper clearance to join us? The suggestion sent a chill through the assembled academics. If human military records required Omega Black clearance, then someone with that level of access would be a member of the Hegemony Council itself, or someone even more powerful. For the first time in his career, Professor Gorleth began to suspect that his lecture series might have been founded on a fundamental misunderstanding. The emergency communication request appeared on the auditorium's main display before Gorleth could regain his composure. Chief Archivist Melinda's six-eyed visage materialized in frantic, high-resolution detail, her usually immaculate feathers disheveled, and her multiple pupils dilated with panic. "Professor Gorleth, you must cease this lecture immediately," she squawked, her voice carrying the distinctive tremor of someone who had just stumbled upon information far beyond their clearance level. The human student. She cannot be permitted access to any military databases, restricted or otherwise. The auditorium erupted in whispers and clicks of confusion. Chief Archivist Melinda was known throughout the galaxy for her methodical calm and unflappable demeanor. Seeing her in such a state was like witnessing a star collapse in real time. "Archivist Melinda," Gorleth began, his tentacles writhing nervously, "I'm afraid I don't understand the urgency. We're simply conducting an academic discussion about comparative military doctrine." "Academic discussion?" Melinda's voice cracked, reaching frequencies that made several species physically uncomfortable. "Professor, do you have any idea what's contained in those files? The casualty numbers alone—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as she realized what she had almost revealed. The human student, who had been observing the exchange with growing interest, took a step forward. "Casualty numbers? I'm sorry, but I don't understand why historical data would be classified. Most of our conflicts are well documented in our public archives." Melinda's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her feathers stood on end, creating a defensive display that hadn't been seen from her species in centuries. "Public archives?" she shrieked. "You mean your population knows about these numbers? They're not classified on your own planet?" "Well, no," the human replied, her tone growing more puzzled. "Why would we classify our own history? Children learn about our major conflicts in school, the world wars, the regional conflicts, the peacekeeping missions. It's all part of our educational curriculum." A strangled sound emerged from Melinda's throat. "The database," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the communication link. "When we tried to compile the casualty figures for the galactic census, the system couldn't process the numbers. We thought it was a computational error. The mortality rates were so high the algorithm assumed we were looking at extinction events, not military conflicts." The alien audience sat in stunned silence. Even the Kreks, whose own warrior culture celebrated death in battle, exchanged nervous glances. The Vorthak's collective consciousness rippled with unease, while the Zephyrien's crystalline forms began to dim with anxiety. "But that's impossible," Professor Gorleth protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "The numbers would have to be astronomical for our systems to register them as extinction events. We're talking about casualties that would dwarf entire planetary populations." The human student nodded thoughtfully. "Oh, you're probably looking at the 20th century data. That was admittedly a rough period for us. 2 global conflicts, plus all the regional wars, civil wars, and smaller conflicts. The estimates vary, but most historians put the total somewhere between 1 and 200 million deaths, just from warfare alone." The communication link went silent. Chief Archivist Melinda had fainted, her unconscious form slumping over her console before the transmission automatically terminated. The human glanced around the auditorium, noting the sea of shocked faces staring back at her. "I'm sorry, did I say something wrong? Those numbers don't include casualties from disease, famine, or natural disasters, just direct military action." A crystalline zephyr in the third row produced a sound like breaking glass and collapsed into component shards. 2 Krex warriors began hyperventilating, their mandibles clicking in distress. Even the Vorthak's collective consciousness seemed to fragment momentarily, unable to process the implications. 200 million, Gorleth whispered, his tentacles trembling. "In a single century. From a species with no natural weapons, no coordinated battle consciousness, no—" He stopped, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "What weapons did you use?" The human hesitated, seeming to sense for the first time that she might be venturing into sensitive territory. "Well, most of the conflicts used conventional weapons, projectile firearms, explosives, aircraft, naval vessels. Though toward the end of the period we did develop nuclear weapons. The word hit the assembly like a shockwave. Nuclear weapons were theoretical constructs for most galactic species, mathematical possibilities that existed only in the realm of advanced physics. The energy requirements alone made them impractical for all but the most desperate planetary defense scenarios. Nuclear weapons, Gorleth repeated, his voice barely a whisper. You developed nuclear weapons for warfare? Well, yes, the human replied, her tone suggesting she didn't understand why this was remarkable. We figured out how to split atoms for weapons before we managed interstellar travel. It was actually one of our earlier technological achievements, relatively speaking. The human casually mentioned splitting atoms as if discussing the weather, completely oblivious to the profound implications of her words. In the galactic hierarchy of technological development, nuclear weapons represented a pinnacle of scientific achievement that most species reached only after millennia of peaceful advancement. The idea that a species would develop such devastating capability before even leaving their home system was beyond comprehension. Professor Gorleth felt his worldview crumbling around him. The primitive, weak humans he had been mocking for months had apparently been casually wielding forces that could shatter planets while they were still learning to leave their atmosphere. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. A Vorthak delegate attempted to project a calming mental influence, but the effort backfired spectacularly. The collective consciousness recoiled in horror as they processed the implications of a species that had weaponized nuclear fusion before developing space travel. The mental backlash sent ripples of panic through their entire collective, causing several other Vorthak to disconnect from the shared consciousness entirely. Split atoms, one of the Krek's warriors muttered, his voice filled with awe and terror. They split atoms before they could travel between stars. What kind of species develops planet-killing weapons before they develop proper space travel? The human student shrugged, a gesture that seemed absurdly casual given the circumstances. I suppose we were just more interested in solving immediate problems than exploring space. Nuclear weapons ended our largest conflict, and nuclear power helped fuel our industrial development. It seemed like a practical application of the physics we'd discovered. Practical application. The phrase hung in the air like a death sentence. The assembled academics were beginning to understand that they had been fundamentally wrong about humanity. This wasn't a primitive species that had stumbled into sapience. This was a species that had looked at the fundamental forces of the universe and decided to weaponize them as efficiently as possible. The emergency klaxons began sounding throughout the academy as word of the revelation spread. Within minutes, the auditorium's doors burst open as academy security forces rushed in, followed by several high-ranking officials, whose expressions ranged from panic to grim determination. Dean Corvos, the Academy's senior administrator, strode to the center of the room with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested he was operating under emergency protocols. His usual diplomatic demeanor had been replaced by the cold efficiency of someone dealing with a potential crisis. "This lecture is terminated," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just been briefed on information that fundamentally changed his understanding of the galaxy. All attendees are to report to their respective department heads for debriefing. No discussion of today's revelations is permitted outside of official channels. The human student looked around in confusion as the alien academics began filing out in stunned silence. "I'm sorry, was it something I said? I was just trying to answer the professor's questions about human military history." Dean Corvos approached her with the careful movements of someone approaching a potentially dangerous creature. "Miss, I'm going to need you to come with me. We have some very important people who need to speak with you about your species' technological development." As the auditorium emptied, Professor Gorleth remained frozen at his podium, staring at the holographic display that still showed the innocuous rotating image of a human figure. The same weak, primitive creature he had been mocking for months now appeared in an entirely different light. Every supposed weakness, The lack of natural weapons, the reliance on technology, the individual decision-making suddenly seemed like features of a species that had chosen to externalize their lethality rather than evolve it naturally. The faculty emergency meeting was called before the last of the students had left the building. Within an hour, every department head, senior researcher, and administrative official in the academy was crowded into the main conference chamber. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the kind of barely controlled panic that accompanied paradigm-shifting revelations. Dean Corvos stood at the head of the table, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something approaching shell shock. "Ladies, gentlemen, and collective consciousnesses," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just learned that everything they thought they knew was wrong. "We have a problem. The understatement of the millennium," thought Professor Gorlith as he took his seat among his colleagues. Around the table, the galaxy's leading academics sat in various states of distress, their earlier confidence replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they had been catastrophically wrong about humanity. "As you're all aware," Corvos continued, "today's lecture on human military capabilities has revealed some disturbing information. Our preliminary investigations suggest that we have been fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of human technological development and military doctrine." Dr. Zenthara, the head of Comparative Species Studies, raised one of her forearms. "Dean, surely you're not suggesting that our entire assessment of human capabilities has been incorrect? Our analysis clearly shows them to be among the weakest species in the galaxy." "Physically, yes," Corvos replied grimly, "but it appears that physical weakness may not be the limiting factor we assumed it was. The humans have compensated for their biological limitations through technological advancement that far exceeds what we considered possible for a species of their age and development level." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The entire galactic understanding of species development was based on the assumption that biological and technological advancement proceeded in parallel. Advanced species like the Krex had developed superior technology alongside their natural weapons and armor. The Vorthak had combined their collective consciousness with sophisticated mental amplification devices. The Zephyrians had merged their crystalline biology with quantum manipulation technology. But humans had apparently skipped the biological advancement entirely, pouring all their development into external technologies that multiplied their capabilities exponentially. It was like discovering that the weakest student in class had been hiding a collection of weapons that could level the entire school. "The question before us," Corvos continued, "is how we proceed with this information. We have been teaching courses on human inferiority to a species that apparently weaponized nuclear fusion before they developed interstellar travel. The potential diplomatic implications are staggering." Professor Gorlith finally found his voice. "Dean, what are we actually dealing with here? Are we talking about a species that poses a genuine threat to galactic stability?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. The assembled academics were beginning to understand that they might have been conducting their superiority complex seminars about a species that could potentially wipe out entire civilizations if they chose to do so. Corvos's expression was grim. "That, Professor, is exactly what we need to determine, and we need to determine it quickly, before word of this spreads beyond our walls." The emergency session had been running for 3 hours when the human student was finally escorted into the conference chamber. Dean Corvos had spent the intervening time fielding increasingly frantic communications from the Hegemony Council, each message more urgent than the last. The revelation that humanity possessed nuclear weapons had apparently triggered security protocols that hadn't been activated in over 2 millennia. The assembled faculty watched nervously as the young woman took her seat at the center of the room, surrounded by the galaxy's most distinguished academics, who were now looking at her with a mixture of scientific curiosity and barely concealed terror. She seemed remarkably composed for someone who had just accidentally triggered a galactic security crisis. "Miss," Dean Corvos began carefully, "we've been discussing your earlier comments about human military history, and we realize that our understanding of your species' development may have been incomplete." The human nodded thoughtfully. "I can see how that might happen. Our history can be pretty overwhelming when you encounter it all at once. Maybe it would help if I gave you a proper presentation about human conflict resolution. I could walk you through how we've approached warfare and peace throughout our development." The faculty exchanged glances. A presentation about conflict resolution sounded exactly like what they needed. Surely this would demonstrate humanity's peaceful nature and diplomatic solutions. Perhaps the earlier revelations had been taken out of context. "This would be most helpful," Dr. Zenthara said, relief evident in her voice. "We're particularly interested in your diplomatic approaches and peaceful negotiation techniques." "Absolutely," the human replied with enthusiasm. "I think understanding our approach to conflict resolution will really clarify things. Would it be helpful if I started with just the highlights from the 20th century? That way you can see how we developed our modern approaches to international relations?" Dean Corvos activated the holographic display, grateful to finally be getting some context for the disturbing numbers they'd encountered earlier. A presentation about human diplomacy and peaceful conflict resolution was exactly what they needed to restore some perspective to this situation. The human stood and approached the display with the confidence of someone who had given this type of presentation many times before. "Let me start with some basic statistics to give you a framework for understanding the scope of human conflict resolution during our most transformative century." She gestured to the display, which began showing a timeline of human history. World War I, approximately 17 million military and civilian deaths over 4 years. World War II, estimated between 70 and 85 million deaths over 6 years. Korean War, roughly 5 million casualties. Vietnam War, approximately 4 million deaths. There were dozens of smaller wars, civil conflicts and regional disputes happening simultaneously. The numbers appeared on the holographic display in stark clinical detail. The conference chamber fell silent as the assembled academics processed the scale of destruction the human was describing so matter-of-factly. Dr. Zenthara's forearms began trembling. Several Vorthak delegates disconnected from the collective consciousness entirely, unable to cope with the mental trauma of processing such massive casualty figures. Professor Gorlith stared at the display in horror. "You're describing the extinction of entire planetary populations," he whispered. "How did your species survive?" The human looked puzzled by the question. "Survive? We thrived. The 20th century was actually when we experienced our greatest population growth and technological advancement. The conflicts I mentioned were spread out over 100 years and involved different regions and nations. Most of the planet's population wasn't directly involved in combat at any given time." When Dr. Zenthara finally managed to speak, her voice was barely audible. "But surely this level of conflict must have ended when you achieved space travel, when you made contact with other species and realized you weren't alone in the universe?" The human considered this for a moment. "Well, we haven't really encountered anything worth fighting about in space yet. The few species we've met have been either too far away to pose any territorial concerns, or frankly not competitive enough to represent a significant resource threat." The silence that followed was deafening. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had just been casually dismissed as not competitive enough by a member of what they had considered the weakest species in known space. "You see," the human continued, apparently oblivious to the existential crisis she was causing, "most of our historical conflicts were driven by competition for limited resources: land, water, energy sources, strategic positions. Space is so vast and resource-rich that we haven't encountered those kinds of pressures yet. Everyone we've met so far has been perfectly content to stay in their own systems and engage in peaceful trade." Dean Corvos felt a chill run through his administrative chambers as the implications became clear. Humanity wasn't peaceful because they were naturally diplomatic. They were peaceful because they hadn't found anything they wanted to take by force yet. The emergency communications began flooding in before the human had even finished her presentation. Dean Corvos watched in growing horror as his personal communicator lit up with urgent messages from every department head, administrative official, and security coordinator in the academy. The cascade of notifications created a cacophony of chimes, beeps, and alerts, that filled the conference chamber with an almost musical chaos. Courses relating to human comparative analysis are hereby suspended pending immediate review, read the first message from the Academic Standards Committee. It was followed rapidly by similar directives from the Department of Xenobiology, the Center for Galactic Relations, and the Office of Species Classification. Within minutes, the Academy's entire curriculum structure was being dismantled and rebuilt around the uncomfortable new reality that humanity was not, in fact, a primitive species suitable for academic mockery. Professor Gorleth found himself frantically drafting cancellation notices for his entire lecture series. Introduction to Human Physical Limitations, Comparative Weakness, a case study in evolutionary failure, and why humans will never achieve galactic significance, all disappeared from the course catalogue with the efficiency of someone trying to hide evidence of a catastrophic error in judgment. Dr. Zenthara was simultaneously updating the galactic species database, her four arms working frantically to change humanity's classification from harmless/primitive to something more appropriate. The problem was that no existing classification adequately captured a species that had weaponized atomic forces while still unable to leave their home system. She eventually settled on creating an entirely new category, technologically paradoxical/approach with extreme caution. The registrar's office reported that 17 different courses across 6 departments would need complete restructuring. The popular Galactic Hierarchy, Understanding Your Place in the Cosmic Order seminar would require particularly extensive revision, given that it had placed humanity somewhere between domesticated livestock and decorative plants in terms of galactic significance. Meanwhile, the Academy's Public Relations Department was working overtime to prevent word of the day's revelations from spreading beyond the institution's walls. The last thing they needed was for other academic institutions to discover that the galaxy's most prestigious center of learning had been conducting comedy seminars about a species that could theoretically sterilize entire star systems. The human student, who had been observing the growing panic around her with increasing confusion, finally raised her hand tentatively. "I'm sorry. I think I may have given you the wrong impression about my species. I can see that some of you seem concerned about the historical data I shared." Every eye, sensor, and consciousness in the room focused on her with desperate hope. Perhaps this had all been a misunderstanding. Perhaps the numbers were exaggerated, or the weapons were theoretical, or the conflicts were mythological rather than historical. "I want to assure you that humans are much more civilized now," she continued earnestly. "We've learned from our past mistakes and developed much better approaches to international relations. This century, we've only had a few small wars, and the casualty numbers have been dramatically lower. The conflicts in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and parts of Africa have been relatively contained compared to our 20th century standards." The collective intake of breath from the assembled academics was audible. Even their small wars were apparently still happening. The species they had been mocking was currently engaged in multiple active conflicts, while simultaneously maintaining diplomatic relations with galactic civilization. The final wave of administrative updates began cascading through the Academy's systems as the full scope of the curriculum revision became clear. The Department of Galactic Studies quietly archived their entire collection of human limitations research papers. The Center for Comparative Evolutions pended all publications pending a complete review of their theoretical frameworks. The Academy's famous Weakest Species in the Galaxy Symposium was hastily rebranded as Species Classification, a study in the dangers of premature assessment. By the end of the day, the Academy's course catalogue had been completely restructured around a new core curriculum. The former Human Inferiority Studies program was replaced with an intensive seminar series titled Species You Should Never Ever Provoke, a comprehensive analysis of peaceful coexistence strategies. The human student, meanwhile, returned to her dormitory completely unaware that her simple homework assignment had just triggered the largest revision of galactic diplomatic policy in recorded history. As she settled down to work on her next assignment, a comparative analysis of human and alien approaches to resource management, The Academy's emergency protocols remained active, and several high-ranking officials began drafting very carefully worded messages to the Hegemony Council about the urgent need to reconsider humanity's status in all future galactic affairs.